Welcome to the next in our online conversation series. My name is Paula Gooder and I'm Canon Chancellor here at St Paul's Cathedral and Director of Learning. Today I'm talking to Marilynne Robinson, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning writer and one of Barack Obama's favourite authors. We're talking about her new and brilliant book, Reading Genesis. I hope you enjoy listening to the conversation. Marilynne, it's really lovely to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking the time for this conversation. What I'd like to do as we begin our conversation is just to ask you a question about writing, because one of the things, I have to confess, you are one of my favourite writers, and one of the things that I really love about your writing is that you write both non-fiction and fiction. And I'd love to know what's caused you to get into writing both, because that's quite unusual, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I have a fairly wide variety of interests, I guess, especially things like history. And I've never been able to, sort of make an absolute choice between one thing and another. I mean, my life is more interesting to me, at least, because I articulate my thinking about, really anything that catches my eye.
And do you have a different process of writing, or do you find when you're writing fiction and non-fiction, is it the same kind of process, or do you have different processes?
Well, the experience of writing the two genres, is quite different. Fiction isn't, so largely reliant on my own invention, what comes to my mind and seems to have the quality of truth about it, or reality or beauty or whatever. As far as nonfiction goes, I generally proceed from sources, that I consider worth pondering and doubting or embracing, and it's much more critical and selective and dependent on what is outside me, and it's just very different, feels different. Writing fiction feels a little bit like dreaming, I would say.
That brings me on to the question about the Gilead novels, because one of the things that I think is really striking about all those 4 novels is that normally you get to know an author's voice and they sound very similar. Whatever book they write, they sound very, very similar. But the thing that I was really struck by with those 4 is that your voice sounds different in each one of them. So I'm absolutely convinced you're Jack when you're kind of writing from Jack's voice, and Lila when you're writing from her voice. And I wondered what that felt like to inhabit those people so much that you could sound completely different.
Well, I don't really start a fiction until I have a character who is the perceiver, and I don't feel as though I have that character until I know what his or her voice would sound like. I don't know what that means really in terms of the working of my own imagination. But I think of the books as written from a voice that for me is identical with a character. I recognize these voices because they don't sound like me to myself, they originate out of that kind of distance. Even though, frankly, I do begin to identify very strongly, or begin with a very strong identification with all of them.
And we'll come on to characters when we get into talking about Genesis in more detail, because there seemed to me to be a really interesting connection between the very different characters you find in Genesis and the characters in your novels. But we'll come on to that in a moment. I wanted to ask you, what made you write Reading Genesis? Because it does feel, even though you have always been very varied in your writing, this feels like a different step. And I was fascinated to find out what caused you to take the different step into reflecting on Genesis.
Well, I have taught Old Testament scripture and so on for, over years of time. And I was very aware and had been taught as, shall we say, dogma, that there was a method of criticism that was absolutely established and essential, the documentary hypothesis that emerged in Germany in the middle of the 19th century. It seemed to me as if there was no real need for it, no defense for it really, that it was perfectly possible to read the text as being a collection without assuming that that in any way undercuts the meaning or the value of the the differences of text and so on, that they take as signals of sort of omnium gatherum of a dubious and finally kind of meaningless type. The Genesis establishes the character of God. It is really the first information we have of what the Hebrew view of the sacred and so on is, and so any system of criticism that precludes meaning, precludes a depth of meaning, I thought was, to be avoided unless it could not be avoided, unless it could not be debunked. So I made the experiment of simply reading the text as a literary text without extraneous considerations, things that people really act as if they know and can't know when a particular part of the narrative was written and so on. Anyone who uses language, talks about, say, peas porridge hot or something. It's been forever since we talked about peas or porridge. But I know it because my grandmother knew it, no doubt because her grandmother knew it. Memory culturally preserves the idiom in which certain things are conveyed. And so you can't date when something is recorded by the fact of the language in which it is recorded, and especially something that is memorious in the degree that the Mosaic texts are. How to understand this emergence of a novel culture and all the rest of it. So anyway, I felt as if the proof needed to be made that you don't have to go outside the bounds of the text itself and its own coherence as a literary text in order to read it. And frankly, you can read it much more meaningfully if you simply abandon these unnecessary assertions about its character.
Thank you. I mean, it's one of those things I really enjoyed about the book was because I'm a trained biblical scholar and I've been trained through those historical critical methods, and actually having a book that engages deeply with the text, but which engages from a novelist perspective and rather than sit solely from a historical critical perspective, I found very refreshing and very interesting. I'm just going to, for people who don't know what the documentary hypothesis is, I'm just going to explain it very quickly so that it will make sense to people. As you mentioned, the documentary hypothesis was invented in the 19th century. And the idea is that there are 4 different key voices behind the text, whether they're individual or collective, and that they can be identified as written at different times. And that's what you're talking about, isn't it? That kind of pulling apart the text to be able to identify the different voices. And as I said, I was really interested in having a single voice kind of woven all the way through, which I thought was really, really interesting. So that brings me on to my next question, which is, who is your ideal reader? Did you have in your mind the person who might be reading this while you wrote it? Or is it more that you have a kind of more general reader in mind?
I hope people don't take this the wrong way, but I don't really think of a reader. I never even, I tend to write things that are a little bit outside the range of what is being done, and I mean, about dying ministers in Iowa and that sort of thing, or about how to read Genesis, and I I write things that feel to me as though they satisfy the impulse that led to my writing them. But I'm always sort of braced for the thought that something will be unpublished, Um, I wrote my first novel, Housekeeping, assuming it would never be published. And I found that very, very liberating. Um, I simply write whatever strange project presents itself to my mind. And it is indeed liberating. I feel as though I can answer to something other than the expectation of an audience.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting. It felt in reading Genesis that you'd gone on something of a journey yourself as you were writing the book and engaging with Genesis. And I wondered whether your faith felt different to you at the end of the project than it did at the beginning of the project.
Well, I do feel as though I realized things that I had not dealt with before. I mean, the problem of evil, is of course dominant, in all ancient literature, but in the Bible, certainly, Um, it's very interestingly, it establishes as its first great given that God is good, and that human beings are sacred and central and so on. And yet it deals very directly with the fact that uh, many things that are inexplicably dreadful happen in the world. This is true. And many of them seem to, to dismiss the idea of human sacredness. So, just as a philosophical problem, that is a tremendous, tremendous burden of explication to undertake. I admire the Bible very much because it is extremely straightforward about the fact that there is a great deal of evil to account for in the world and so on. And it doesn't, split reality in half and say there's a good God and an evil God or so. And it's absolutely loyal to the idea of the goodness of the one God, And so it seems to me as if that requires comprehension, definition, and so on. One of the things that seem to emerge to me is that time, the scale of time, as it is relevant to God, is very, very different from time as it's scaled to human beings, And, we do live in this double universe, in effect, of, yes, I have to be online at 11 o'clock in the morning on one hand, and on the other hand, we're receiving light from stars that died millions of years ago. There are two, I mean, there are many, many actually ways of thinking of time that seem not to be compatible with one another. And in Genesis, a great deal depends on this difference of time, difference of immediate, judgment, in effect. I mean, that great scene at the end where Joseph says, "You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good." These are things that have happened on two different scales of time: the immediate crime against the brother on the one hand, and the very long reversal that unfolds in which the actual will of God is revealed.
And I think that's one of the things that really comes through very powerfully in reading your book, is that sense of, as you say, of the time. And that brings me on to the voices that we've mentioned already, and your reading of the different voices in Genesis. And I wondered if you've got reflections on how voices and time interact in the book. So you've got the different characters who come across so vividly, you know, the kind of the tricksiness of Jacob, and the patience of Sarah, and the well, we'll talk about Joseph later, but the insufferability of Jacob. Not Jacob, Joseph. They come across as such distinct characters. And I wondered whether there was anything about the distinction of the characters and the way in which that plays into your understanding of time that you were interested in while you were writing the book.
Well, that's a serious question. I feel as though, I don't know how long this was in process, but I feel as though I learned a great deal from Genesis before I ever wrote about it or anything, about how you establish character, the incredibly fine detailing that makes us know who Joseph is and know who Jacob is and all the rest of it, you know. I think that a lot of people object to the idea of teaching the Bible as literature, but I think that that literature taught us how to write literature. You know, we're not casting backward on inappropriately onto another period, but we're looking to see where, you know, where the great traditions of the novel and so on actually are generated. You know, what the skill of individuation. There's great irony in the character of Jacob, because when you look at what he does, all he ever does is try to anticipate out of his own resources exactly what God wants him to do or wants to happen to him, you know. So he has it's very clever. He has sort of the manner of somebody who's kind of a wheeler dealer, you know. But in fact, if he would just sort of, you know, take things a little easier, he would find, you know, that God's intention for him was identical with his aspirations for himself. I think that's a very interesting thing, you know, kind of humorous, really, you know, granted this great seriousness of Jacob's character and the tragedy of the fact that he had lived however many years with the strong suspicion that his other sons had killed his darling Joseph. You know, what an agonizing household that was, you know, with that much guilt on one side, that much doubt on the other, and so on. It's amazing to me in a way that more plays and so on have not been written about these people. One of the things that's interesting about them is that they're so modest in scale. You know, they're not super people in any way. I mean, Abraham is sublimely patient and faithful. The others are kind of hit and miss as far as, you know, as far as their moral qualities are concerned. But at the same time, God is absolutely loyal to them, and their lives are of tremendous importance. And I think that really is the meaning of the text.
And that again brings me on to something else that I was reflecting on as I was reading the book, is that it felt as though the themes that came through in your book, reading Genesis, were a little bit like a fugue. So you would have themes that would emerge and then they would kind of submerge again and they would emerge again later. And I wondered whether that was something that was deliberate, whether it came out of your reading of Genesis, whether it reflected how you saw Genesis. I was just fascinated by the way in which the themes kind of emerged and submerged as I read through the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I certainly I was trying to be very faithful to the text. I think the text does that beautifully. It's absolutely musical in its, you know, interweavings and harmonies and you know, I you know, I kind of anticipated that because of smoldering objections I've had over time to the way that the text seemed to be read. But when I actually started writing about it, I thought, this is really beautiful. And this is probably something that has hovered in the mind of Shakespeare or, you know, any great writer in that Western tradition, I think.
So in Genesis 1 to 11, one of the things that comes clear from your book is your reflection on the way in which, particularly Genesis 1 and 2, interact with other ancient Near Eastern stories. But of course, that also in 6 to 9 with the stories of the flood, so both creation and flood. I wondered if you wanted to reflect a little bit on what was so strikingly different about the way in which Genesis wrote in comparison to the other ancient Near Eastern stories that you refer to.
The creation stories tend to be in other cultures tend to be strife. They tend the real issue is Marduk, the ultimate god of this, of Babylon and so on. Um, the and there's always a suggestion of another reality, with our earthly reality being an enormously trivial offshoot of it. Really, we have we are created to do the chores that the gods don't want to do, and to feed them and so on. But the God of Genesis is the let there be poetry is an incredible articulation of the absolute unforced power of this one God. So the world is created originally out of divine will, and it is extremely harmonious with itself. I just wrote a kind of explication of a text that's published anyway. But the idea that Jesus was God, I was talking about a passage in the Gospel of John that begins with that wonderful, identification of God and Jesus together. But you think of Jesus in the world that, according to John, he created. And you think of how did the moon look to him, and there was a moment when these things were decided and created with complete freedom. It's very I think it's a great sort of sacralization of everything, that its origins are seen as so obviously freely created and beautiful and good. I'm not aware of any other creation story that describes creation as good. So far as I know, that's a Hebrew concept, and it's insisted on in those texts. And then the world that is laid out for us is the world of common experience, birds flying and fish swarming and all the rest of it, so that rather than cooking up some silly evolutionary idea or something like that, what it's doing is blessing as intended every creature, everything that exists, that being the world in which finally human beings are set. If you think of it in terms of what it would have meant to people to believe that, then the generosity of the text, this sort of incredibly lucid imagination of the text is it's not like anything else.
And that brings us on to probably the most interpreted version of verse from Genesis 1, that male and female were created in the image of God. And I wonder if you'd want to say anything more about why that's important in the Genesis creation narrative.
Well, I think it's important because it's true. I like very much the fact that the writer lingers over the fact that the divinity of human beings is not, made. There are not subcategories where people are less or more sacred, less or more Adamic. All genders, all families, the Genesis is very careful never to assume that people have any other origin than the origin they share together. That in Adam and Eve, that's again incredibly important and incredibly rare. Even places like Athens and so on, very high civilizations, had narratives about how Athenians were created separately from other people, and this had all kinds of legal consequences and so on. That never happens in the Old Testament, and I think that's beautiful. I mean, quite amazing.
And the contrast between that such high theology of humankind that you get right at the start of Genesis, and then the stories of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, I mean, it's really quite jolting, isn't it? And it was one of the things that I found you brought out so well in your book, that you have this immensely high vision of who human beings were created to be, and then you have the lived reality of what they were actually doing. There's a particular bit that I'd just quite like to read because it struck me so much, which will sound very familiar to you. What is theological about watching domestic malaise and turmoil work its way through these lives? Let us say that God lets human beings be human beings, and that his will is accomplished through or despite them, but is never dependent on them. And I think that contrast with that that comment that you made and Genesis 1, you've got kind of a really beautiful theology of what it means to be human being.
Yes, well, I'm very moved, frankly, by the fact that we go from Adam to Abraham. We don't know what human beings are in God's sight. We really don't. And I suspect that there is a huge overplus of value in any human being in God's sight, which we can't perceive or be adequate to. I love so much that passage where God and Abraham stand at the door of a tent and look at the sky that's absolutely radiant with stars. Think what it must have looked like when there was nothing to intervene between a human gaze and a starry sky. What God is doing basically is saying those will be people, or the people that will issue from this this narrative are like that, the radiant sky, the uncountable but all glorious stars. um it seems to me, if that's God's anthropology, you know I mean, nothing could be farther from like the Babylonian conception of human beings, for example, but for God to see that future as beautiful in the degree that we're told it is, then we have to take a new look at what human beings are. If we're not impressed with them, I think we're probably making a terrible mistake.
And if I can just kind of pick up on a theme that's kind of connected to that, there's something very important in your book about the patriarchs believing God, and the contrast of that with us, where we often talk about believing in God. Was there something you'd like to say about your understanding of particularly Abraham and his faith, which of course becomes so important in the New Testament as well?
Yes. It seems as if, on the example of Abraham, faith reposes with God. I mean, Abraham is simply quietly enduring and faithful, and God elevates him into a place in history, which indeed he does enjoy, without Abraham doing more than being faithful, patient, and again, over and over again, it seems to me, in Genesis, there is the assertion that God is faithful to the covenant. God is faithful to the individuality of human beings. Uh, God is faithful to the world that he made to share with human beings, really. Um, and it's as if, I don't know, it's as if there's a faith that is in repose and all the purer for that fact. That simply to see the world as it is made, you know. I just came across a quote, I think in Plato's Republic, where he says he knows a man, Socrates says, who believes in God, would not believe in God, except that in the world he sees the hand of an artist. And I think that that is a kind of version of what I consider to be the reposefulness of the kind of faith you find in Abraham. You know, uh, it is unstrenuous, it is unjudgmental. You know, it is it is a felt experience of a sufficiency that is not self-sufficiency. I don't know. I'm thinking it's an interesting question. I think if you believe in God in the way that we normally talk about it, it's as if we have constructed something in our heads that we are content to call God, and we are content to say we believe in it the same way we believe in gravity, or, you know, um, and that objectifies God in a way that is not, that makes it not experiential. The, you know, that minimizes the degree to which humankind and God are sort of in intrinsic conversation with each other. Um, I think that the accumulation of, you know, what I've called declensions, you know, uh, make this harder and harder for people to feel or to understand. But that seems to me to be very characteristic of Abraham, and less in every succeeding generation.
Yeah, no, that's the really striking bit, isn't it? Was where you've got Abraham, who is the pinnacle of faith, Isaac, and then Jacob, and it, as you say, it's a slippery slope down from Abraham. The other theme that is so striking for me in Genesis is that of covenant. And have you got thoughts about why covenant is so important in Genesis?
Well, you know, it's the continuous, you know, it's the mode in which God continuously declares his faithfulness to human beings. Um, you know, I mean, culturally, it was, you know, a promise, in effect, a bond of loyalty extended by a more powerful to a less powerful figure. And the the desire to extend protection and help and the rest of it, and love, I suppose. The You know, that's consistent with the kind of benevolence that is often talked about in those terms throughout the Bible. You know, the God that protects and the God that is loyal. Um, so it, in a way, you know, we find out that it's not dependent on human beings. That people like Isaac and Jacob are really not sources of wisdom on this fact. You know, they're simply in repose, as it were. They are those to whom God has chosen to be faithful, in standing in for the rest of humankind. Um, it's a lot of things could be called kind of arbitrary in this self-introduction of God that is Genesis. And one of them is the recurrent image of the covenant, in which that means you may not be faithful, but I am, you know.
And does that underpin your faith at all? I mean, is that some, because for me that resonates very deeply with my faith, in the sense that I I don't have to be brilliant. I don't have to believe 25 impossible things before breakfast. I just have to be in repose in the God who loves me and has promised to love me from the dawn of creation. And there's something for me that is immensely resonant in that. And if I turn out to be like Jacob, then it still doesn't matter. God, the unfailing love of God still continues onwards. Is that something that resonates in your faith as well?
Well, absolutely. I would say almost it defines my faith. Uh, we live in odd times. You don't have to be terribly well informed to notice that. And it's, the idea that God is faithful over time and that he retains very much the capacity to invert events, change meanings, change, open passages into future time that we could not have anticipated, and so on. That's all, I think, very clearly a subject of Genesis.
So we've been talking about the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and then we can't leave the book of Genesis without talking about Joseph. We've mentioned him already, but we'll return to him. I must admit, when I read the stories of Joseph, he comes across as an insufferable character. I'm thinking, why on earth did you do that? And why did you say that out loud? And it's almost as though he goads his brothers into action. And I'm wondering what your view of Joseph is, and why you think he's portrayed in the way that he is.
Well, I mean, he seems like a pretty familiar type, frankly,
Yes. Yes.
people that make their way in the world, I mean, and are very confident of their own capacities and are very prone to making very big mistakes and so on. I mean, we have a whole, I mean, I don't know what you think about this clutch of people that are trying to determine the course of human events, but I'm, I think that perhaps they would do better to, doubt themselves a little. In any case, though, everything is always mingled. I mean, I think that the shock and disappointment that Joseph must have felt when he realized that his brothers had really done what they had done to him, and then that guilty acting out the murder by carrying around this bloody garment, and horrifying their father with it. I mean, it's dreamlike. It's so strange, and so reprehensible. I mean, but Joseph is not simply to be condemned outright. He does a lot of things that are wrong and stand as wrong, but he suffered enormously and is ready to forgive his brothers, which is very beautiful. I think that the characterization and the narrative of Genesis is always saying, be human, or you are human. Try to be a good human. But you don't have to be you will not be, more accurately, a paragon. You probably no saint. Our safety, considered in theological terms, is based on the fact that God loves people like Joseph, like Jacob, like you and me, and apparently, we seem to be at the very tips of his fingers insofar as his control of what we do. It's almost as if the power of God is most amazingly expressed in the fact that he could create a creature that seems to exist in some area of freedom from him. We pay for that dearly. So does, Jesus, Nevertheless, we are human and we have to have freedom in order to be human. And we have to have freedom in order to act the role of the erring son, the man overwhelmed with his own power and brilliance when he ought not to be, and so on. If we had to be saints, it would be bad news for us, you know. Um, so I find it beautifully reassuring that Joseph is Joseph and Jacob is Jacob. You know, I find it very meaningful.
I've been leaving a question towards the end, so I'm now going to come on to it, because one of the questions that is asked over and over again about Genesis is historicity, and what relationship there is between Genesis and history, the things that actually happened. And I didn't want to distract us early on in our conversation by talking about it, but I know there'll be people who will want me to ask. So let me ask now, before we come to an end. What are your reflections if somebody asks you about historicity and the book of Genesis? How would you respond?
I think it has the kind of historicity that is consistent with a culture, a people who were oppressed for, we're told, 400 years, you know. And then an event happens, you know, where they close together as one people, and they try to reconstruct themselves from fragments of memory and you know, and the best insights of their religious leaders and so on. And then probably with a master thought, you know, a master thinker like Moses, call him Moses, putting together what might seem meaningless suffering and anomie, you know, putting it together as the narrative that can start a nation. Um, I think that it would be, you know, a lot of it would be some version of history that had perhaps drifted out of shape, you know, over the course of being repeated for generations by people for whom it was just a little filament of memory, you know. Then somebody else, call him Moses, looks at all these things together and says, "Oh, I see what that means. I see what it is," you know. So I think it reflects the history of the emergence of a people. I think it's very historical in that sense. I think that we can see, like in the flood story, that they historically were dealing with the influence of Babylon, taking narratives of Babylonian origin that were very important at that time to many peoples, um, and converting it into another statement about the nature of God and so on, you know, so that it, in a sense, defends the conception of God against the influence of what would be a powerfully influential other culture, you know. Um, so I see that kind of historicity. It's like, you know, if you read English chronicle histories, you know, it's the same kind of thing where you find fragments and fragments and fragments, and the question is, in how is this historical? Why was it preserved? How far can one rely on it? Um, but nevertheless, it is historical in the sense that it's an attempt to articulate origins and character and all the rest of it. Um, so that's simply the sense in which I see it as historical.
Thank you. So we're towards the end of our conversation now, and I hope you will excuse me if I ask you the question of where next. Have you got other projects lined up? Are you continuing in this vein with other books in the Bible? Do feel free to say, mind your own business. But I was wondering if you have other projects in the pipeline.
Well, you know, I'm working on a book about Exodus. I think that Genesis and Exodus are very much companion pieces. And, you know, that one of the things that's really remarkable about Genesis is that it has so few laws, very little legalism of any kind, you know. Um, and then in response, I think, to that, you know, you have the laws of Moses, which are again, I would say part of the tact of God in refusing to intrude on human beings in intrinsically, and so are laws that you are asked to internalize, but they do not change human character. They're simply, you know, that human beings are free in the fact that they can obey or not obey any law at any time. You know, so we're not intruded upon in the sense that we have the latitude of our freedom to act individually. And law is often seen as oppressive, but in fact it's not. The means by which, as opposed to conditioning and all the other things that are tried, it is another meaningful human choice in any given instance to be obedient to law or not.
Sounds fascinating. I am very much looking forward to reading it when you've completed it. Thank you so much for your time today, Marilynne. It's been wonderful talking to you and reflecting on Genesis. And as I say, very much looking forward to reading Exodus.
Great. I hope I'm done in a year or so. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
been lovely to talk with you.